Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Justice and Pieces guest speaker series. Today, we are joined by Ryan Watkins here, who is an employment lawyer and partner at Whit and Lublin. Ryan, thanks for joining us. Perhaps maybe you can tell us a little bit more about yourself and your practice and how you got into law.
Sure. Thanks for having me, JP. So I'm an employment lawyer here in Toronto. I represent both employers and employees throughout the whole employment relationship. So all the way from hiring to firing. And on the employee side, typically I represent in terms of the dismissals and representing employees with wrongful dismissals, constructive dismissals, harassment, human rights complaints. So that's where my majority of focus is on. In terms of how I got started. When I went to law school, I didn't know what area I wanted to focus on. And in my second year, I took an employment law course, and I really enjoyed it. And I found my fit. And from then on, I took more and more employment and labor courses. Really enjoyed it and focused my career on that, and have been practicing law now for 10 years. 5 years at this firm, and have been a partner at this firm for 2 years now.
So you mentioned a few things there in terms of employment related matters. What are some, maybe you can elaborate a bit more on some of the different types of matters that you can see as an employment lawyer? I mean, on both sides there, and how do you kind of navigate avoiding, if you're representing both sides, that you don't happen to have a client that used to be working at a client that you've previously had? How do you kind of try to avoid those conflicts as much as possible?
Yeah, so we have a great intake team here that before any client signs up, we make sure to run a conflict search to make sure that we haven't represented on either side of the coin. And typically in terms of when we represent employees, a lot of those employees work for large organizations, banks, telecommunications. So you see, some of the large companies quite frequently pop up, and we try to negotiate whatever what may be going on in terms of issues, negotiate and represent the client on behalf of those. And in terms of what you see on both sides, it's a lot. There's a ton in terms of employment law, what you see on a day-to-day basis, and I think that's why I really love it. At the heart of it, you're dealing with people, you're dealing with what goes on in the workplace, and outside of our home life, we spend the most time at work and interacting with our colleagues. And so there's a lot there in terms of the relationship, and also can lead to a lot of friction within the relationship, which inevitably causes issues, and can sometimes lead to a break in that relationship. And so I see a lot in terms of on the employer side. What's great about the employer side is it reflects how society is and what the news of the day. And so for the last 2 years, obviously it's been the pandemic, and so we've been dealing a lot with that. We've been dealing with drafting policies for employers to help them navigate through the pandemic. Anywhere from mandatory vaccination policies to layoff policies. There have been another number of pieces of legislation that have come through during the pandemic. So making sure that employers are on side and have policies to be able to communicate to their employees. And then on the employee side, it's always fairly consistent in terms of dismissals, and so that's what you see the most, where um, an individual or employee will seek out an employment lawyer. It's usually they've been let go, they've been offered a package, or haven't been, and want to see what rights that they have with respect to that dismissal. And then outside of dismissals, you see a lot of, sometimes there's friction within the workplace. So either harassment and bullying. Um, that's been down in the pandemic because people primarily have been working from home. So there hasn't been as much interaction in the workplace that causes that friction. So certainly you see less of that happening. But as the society opens up and people return to the workplace, you're seeing those type of issues creep up more. And then you have what's called constructive dismissals. You see a lot of those in terms of where there's a fundamental change in the employment relationship. It can be something like a change in compensation. And so in the pandemic, what you saw, at least at the beginning, you were seeing, frequently where employers were shutting down their operations, and as a result, laying off people or reducing their compensation. And so there was, a question whether that rises to a fundamental change, and whether that's a constructive dismissal. And so seeing a lot of those as well.
So you did mention, I mean, obviously today, even loosening of restrictions and things are happening, but one of the issues that has been kind of prevalent over the last few months there is relating to vaccines and mandates. And now if the government's position changes and maybe a private workplace doesn't change along with it, can they still terminate you if you don't wish or are unable to get vaccinated? Or on the other end, maybe if you feel that because now people are not going to have to wear masks and you don't feel very safe and you don't want to be in that kind of environment, does the employer still kind of have those abilities in light of the fact that the government rules may be changing?
Yeah, so that's still an open question. I think that hasn't been decided. I mean, in terms of um, where things are going, you always have to look to court cases, because as you know, in the system that we have that judges make the law, other judges follow the law until the Court of Appeal or the Supreme Court makes a decision. And so right now cases are working their way through the system. It does take some time to get those decisions, and so it's an open question right now. I think my personal view is that if an employer has a vaccine mandate, which is totally acceptable to have, if employees don't agree with that and don't want to get vaccinated, an employer is within their rights to let that employee go. But I believe that if you're going to do that, you have to provide that employee with severance, save and except certain circumstances. So, I think in a hospital setting, or in other areas, long-term care homes, having a vaccination policy makes sense. And if employees don't comply in those vulnerable sectors, there's an argument to be made, then that's cause for dismissal, which wouldn't entitle an employee to severance necessarily. But in all other cases, I believe that employees, if you are going to let them go for not following a vaccination policy, that they should be entitled to compensation as a result. Now that has to be, borne out in court. And like I said, we're still waiting for decisions on that, but that's my personal view.
Now, related to that, let's say you're vocal about your positions. Turns out, let's say Matt supports the Freedom Convoy, and you've seen some of those lists or things, names get leaked or donations or anything like that, and the company's like, well, this is such negative publicity for us. We're gonna lose business. Can they just terminate people because of the impact that might have, or even again on the other side, perhaps um, if you're a vocal supporter of getting vaccinated, and that may cause customers maybe not to support that business. Is that something within a company's rights to fire you because of some unrelated work reason?
So companies can let employees go for what we call off-duty conduct, uh, things that happen outside of the workplace if it does affect the workplace. So it is possible to have off-duty conduct be cause for dismissal. With that said, that's a really high bar to meet. It certainly, we would have to show as an employer that it does have a detrimental impact on on that organization, uh, that company, and that really is a high bar to meet, to say a certain individual who has political views, based on what's going on, or what did go on in Ottawa with the convoy, to say that's enough for a dismissal. That's a tough one to say would be successful in a court case. With that said, there are, I'm sure, certain circumstances where that could be the case, but it's definitely a high bar to meet. At the end of the day, you operate under the prism as an employer that I can let an employee go for any reason except for a discriminatory reason, right? So you certainly can't say, I'm going to let you go because you're a female, or let you go because you're a male. Um, that would be against the Human Rights Code. But if an employer doesn't agree with somebody's political views, they have the right to let an employee go, but they have to provide severance. There's always silly examples, like for example, if you're an employer and you want all your employees to like the Toronto Raptors, and one person likes the LA Lakers, you can say, I don't I don't want you around anymore. See you later. That's fine. That's not discriminatory. But you gotta provide them severance on the way out. So
Yeah, with the Lakers of late, I think you're going to have less employers having that problem these days. So, but I guess the thing there is that you have to provide that notice there, and uh, as long as you've given them sort of fair warning to that they can find another job, then you can frame it that way. But I think what you're saying is that if you're trying to allege cause, you're going to have a lot more difficult time trying to justify that.
yeah, absolutely. That's in employment law, we call cause the capital punishment. So it's definitely a high bar to meet, and employers should not be alleging cause willy-nilly, because judges will punish employers who do that, and are not able to prove it.
Now we were talking about like restrictions changing, and now you're going to see perhaps a lot more people returning back in person to the workplace. And really, for over the last 2 years, I think a lot of employees have got used to being working at home and making adjustments. And with gas prices like skyrocketing, and thinking, hey, I don't really want to come into the office. I've obviously been successful over the last 2 years without coming into the office. Does this create like a duty to accommodate in any means now, if related to um, if you have kids or other criteria there, um, or I mean, could now you see employees asking for greater compensation if they're asked to return to work in light of that change, or I mean, or are the employers going to be able to say, well, you came to work 2 years ago at the same relative package there, so we gave you a break and now it's back to the office. How's that all going to be sorted out?
Yeah, it remains to be seen. I mean, in terms of a duty to accommodate, that's done on a case by case basis. There's certainly going to be scenarios. You mentioned childcare. That's an area where there could potentially be a duty to accommodate. And so, we'll have to see in terms of, you know, why the employee is saying that they can't come back to the workplace. And each individual case has to be assessed on their merits. But, on a general basis, just saying because I worked for 2 years at home, that should entitle me to continue to work from home. I don't see that argument is going to fly because the employer does have the right, save for the exceptional circumstances and human rights areas. They have a right to operate their workforce how they see fit. And if operationally it's best to have the employees back in, and you could see the argument for that in terms of employee morale and ensuring that the staff is working and collaborating together. You could see reasons why employers do want their employees back in, as well as to monitor productivity. An employer is entitled to say that, and I think we are starting to see that now. Certainly, the big companies are telling their employees that they must come back to work. That brings other challenges, I think, for employers as well, because you have to look at it also from the employee side. And we've heard about certainly in America, I think we've seen it less to a degree here, but the great resignation, where you're seeing employees resigning en masse because they don't like their situation, they don't like how much they're getting paid, they don't like how they're being treated, they don't like their work arrangement, so they're resigning and finding something that makes them happy. And that's what the pandemic has kind of brought a self-awareness that, hey, I want to be happy in where I work and what I do. And so employers have to recognize this, that the sentiment among mass employees is that they want more control over that so-called work-life balance. And so if you're trying to retain the best talent, it may make sense to continue having your employees work from home if that makes them happy, or some type of hybrid model where they come in for a few days. So each industry is different, every workforce is different, but in order to survive and to grow as a company, you're only as strong as your workforce, right? And so if they're not happy, then you're going to see that bear out. So that's something to keep in mind in terms of having workers return to work. If you enforce that carte blanche, and your workers aren't happy about it, you're likely going to have to reassess whether that makes sense, especially for employees who have been at home for 2 years and like it and have been able to navigate it. Bringing them back might not be in the best interest of the company.
So if you're looking at, if an employer were to come and say, well, look, we're trying to create some kind of transition policies and try to alleviate some of those concerns. I mean, as you pointed out, at least in the US, you're seeing a lot of people saying, well, why, we have more control now, we want more control, and we've seen that it's worked. How do you kind of find that in terms of maybe striking a balance? Because at the same time, it may affect the ability in terms of, you mentioned like productivity, things like that. Is it more about looking at more flexible solutions now in light of that, or are you finding that employers are kind of now perhaps being afraid of a lot of people quitting, that they may have to reassess what they're offering?
Yeah, so every workplace is different, every industry is different, but in general, yes, employers need to assess what works best for them in conjunction of working with your employees. I think employers who run their corporations like a dictatorship, and say this is how it's going to be, too bad if you don't like it, those are the ones that are not going to be successful. You have to um, hear what your workforce is saying, and if they're saying, hey, we want some flexibility, and we can still get our work done, do it well. We've been doing it for 2 years. You've got to listen to that, or you're going to lose those workers to a competitor who's offering a different model, right? And so employers are certainly going to have to listen, because, like I said, employees now are realizing that they have some power. The imbalance, the employer employee imbalance that's been there is starting to even out a little bit, where employees are having more choice and are willing to make the move. Gone are the days where it was the time of our parents who stayed with one company for 30 years. Those days are gone. Employees will move, and they will move frequently if they feel that what they're looking for is not being taken care of with that employer.
Now, you brought up again some of these demanding employers, and certainly where they exist, and even in the legal industry, sometimes you hear of a lot of big law where there's a lot of demands, a lot of stress, and it may lead to perhaps emotional distress at work. Is that something you could sue your employer for if they cause this emotional distress to you?
Well, that depends. I mean, certainly on an employee side, that too is a high bar, because, as you can imagine, if it was the case, you could just assert, my employer is not making me feel well. All right, I don't feel great by this decision being made. If that were just the case, then it's such a low bar, anybody could assert the claim and get monetary damages as a result. And so that's certainly not what we want to see. So it has to be real, right? An employer has to do something that is essentially outrageous against the employee to to bring those type of damages, which should be the case. If the employer is doing something wrong, causing an employee to, for example, have a mental breakdown, uh, there should be a punishment attached, and employees should feel and do have recourse, if that's the case.
Now, speaking on that point, in the legal community, one of the things I've talked to a lot of people here about is what can we do to better sort of in our own industry, right, to address mental health, right, in terms of it's kind of like ironic that if we're talking about employees and being able to do things like that, what about lawyers and paralegals and everyone else? I mean, what can you share there in terms of ways that the conversation certainly is changing, but taking care of your mental health before in an industry where there's a lot of demand, a lot of tight deadlines, of navigating all of that?
Yeah, that's a great point, because in the legal profession, depression is high, suicide is high, um, alcoholism, drugs is very high. We do have a very demanding profession, and like doctors, you really can't be wrong um, in our profession, because there's consequences if you're wrong, right? It's not a place where if you are you make a mistake, that there are no consequences. Unfortunately, the legal profession has losers and winners, ultimately, and so uh, you know having that feeling that you always have to get it right and be perfect is very demanding on your mental health. And so we as a profession have to do a better job at understanding uh, that, and do a better job at listening, and do a better job as lawyers and paralegals to say we need help. Lawyers often put up a facade sometimes that we're Superman or Superwoman, and certainly that's not the case, because no one is a superhero. And so we need to acknowledge when we need help, or we're not feeling well and doing well mentally. And there are some great programs out there through the Law Society and others, some great free programs as well, where we can reach out if we do need help, and we should absolutely do that more, and encourage that uh, when we do need help, because it is a very tough profession to be in. And you have other demands of clients, demands of bosses as well. And so there's sometimes can feel, especially with the workload as well, like there's no escape. So, sometimes you feel like you're drowning. It's coming from all sides, and so it is important to reach out, to get those necessary tools to help us cope in this profession.
Now, on that point, I mean, both for those in the legal profession and outside of the profession, I think there was a new law that came out about giving employees time to unplug and all of that. What does that mean exactly? I guess from an employment perspective, does that mean that there's got to be certain hours that they can't connect with you, or what happens with email and things like that, or has this yet to kind of again be fleshed out from company to company, from industry to industry?
Yeah, the law on that is pretty vague. I mean, employers, so larger employers, so have to be 25 employees or over. Employers have to create policies that address the right to disconnect. So the right for employees outside of work to be able to not have to focus on work. What those policies look like, we don't know yet. We just know that those employers are required to create a policy. The hope is that there'll be more information in terms of regulations on what exactly has to go into the policy. Um, but even without that, I think it makes sense, and it's incumbent on employers to start to think about what a policy should look like in terms of employees disconnecting. You want to think about, okay, after a certain time, should emails be allowed to be sent, or should employees be working, after a certain time, or what can an employer do in terms of wellness for their employees, whether it's having specific wellness days or creating additional benefits like gym memberships or things of the like to help benefit employees and their well-being. And so this is an opportunity, even not knowing what should go into the policy, to start to think about what makes sense from a policy perspective to help their employees to disconnect. Now, in some industries and professions, it will be difficult, and it may not be the case where you can really disconnect. There's, some professions where, that's simply just not possible. But what can an employer do in those situations to try to alleviate that situation and make it better for the employee?
See a question here about what, I mean, your experience there. What are the biggest mistakes? I guess maybe you can look at it from the employee side and then the employer side that potential clients or clients have made that you wish you can say, hey, I can turn back the hands of time. Wish you came to me a month ago before you did that. What are the biggest mistakes that employees and employers make pertaining to, I know it's very broad certainly, but let's look at it maybe from the dismissal context.
So I think on both sides, the biggest mistake that both employers and employees make is the relationship, the parameters of the relationship from the beginning, right? And that really comes down to the employment contract and what that looks like, because that sets out how the employment relationship is going to be governed. And so, from the employer side, certainly you want to ensure that you discuss and have a provision in terms of what if things go bad, what does that look like in terms of entitlements for the employee on the way out in terms of a dismissal. And certainly you don't want to leave that open-ended, because then it's up to a judge to decide what's fair and reasonable. And certainly in most cases, that's more than the statutory minimum required by law. And on the employee side, you're going to want the least amount of limitations as possible. Sometimes I'll have somebody come to me at the end, they've been let go, and I always ask to see the employment contract. And if the employment contract has a termination provision that is valid, then oftentimes it's you're out of luck, employee, because that's been set from the beginning of what you're entitled to, and a judge is not going to alter that because that's what you agreed to at the beginning. And so, I have to say, I wish you would have come to me at the beginning of the employment relationship so we could have worked on that contract together to make it more favorable to you. So I think it all goes back in terms of the biggest mistake is how the relationship should be defined at the outset, instead of looking at when something goes wrong, what should happen.
And then for, I guess, on the employer side, if they don't put in one of those clauses and they're like, hey, Ryan, don't I just have to give this guy 2 weeks? Why does that create a problem for them?
Yeah, because, under the law, you have, two types of rights. An employee is entitled to their statutory rights, which is set out in the Employment Standards Act. That's the bare minimum that they should get if we're talking about upon termination. But that's just the bare minimum. And without a proper enforceable employment contract, that employee is going to be entitled to what we call the common law, what a judge thinks is fair and reasonable. And in looking at that, a judge is going to look at a number of factors. A judge is going to look at how old that employee is, knowing that older employees, it's harder to be reemployed, right? If you're close to retirement age, Unfortunately, and it shouldn't be the case, but a lot of employers aren't looking to hire somebody in their 60s, right? And so you got to look at the age, you got to look at the title, right? Somebody in an executive level position, it's going to be harder for them to find another executive job, whereas an entry level position is going to be much easier. So you have to look at the position the person's in. You got to look at how long they've been there for. Somebody there for 20 odd years, it's going to be difficult to find a different company when you've been doing something the same way for all those years. It's going to be hard to be employable, right? So those are the type of things that you're going to look at in terms of deciding what's fair and reasonable. If there's no employment contract that's enforceable that outlines what that employee should get, and for an employer, that can be scary, right? I mean, you think that somebody's entitled to 2 weeks, for example. Maybe they're entitled to 2 years, right? That's a huge commitment in terms of compensation that you could potentially have to pay to an employee, just because you didn't define the relationship at the beginning.
Now, one of the other things we've talked about quite a bit, and last year we had you on talking about confronting anti-Black racism, specifically there in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion in both the legal profession and in other professions there. Now, I remember you had done some research, I think, about the low numbers. I mean, I know you're a partner there on a pretty prominent employment firm. Have you noticed anything in the last year? Is there any change? Are you seeing more Black people, people of color, Indigenous people, women? I mean, in terms of these roles, or have you looked into it anymore since looking at it last year?
So I think, sadly, there's been more talk, more chatter within the legal industry and corporate corporations at large, but seeing an actual difference, I still don't see it. Minorities, people of color are still underrepresented in the legal field, certainly underrepresented at the highest levels, at the partnership levels. That's still the case. A lot obviously has to do with the pipeline in terms of students applying to law school who are people of color, and firms choosing them once they get to law school for those firm roles. I mean, you're not going to have partners if you don't first have people of color who are associates. And so, the pipeline still isn't there. Hopefully we see a better job at that in terms of recruitment. But, at the highest levels, we still don't see the numbers increasing like they should, unfortunately.
No, we just wrapped up Black History Month there, and the theme was February and forever. And what you're talking about here, right, is the pipeline. I mean, how far back do we have to kind of go in terms of instilling more positive changes? I mean, hopefully we don't have this question every year, and you're telling me the same thing every year, right? Is what can we do? I mean, in terms of having more positive changes, changing that dynamic, and is it? I mean, how far back do we need to go in terms of that pipeline? Because again, if there's no people of color in law school, then there's no articling students that are going to be people of color, and then there's no associates and no partners. Or is there anything more that we can do to instill this change?
Yeah, I think we have to rethink, the whole pipeline system. We have to go all the way back to, high school to instill in people of color that, they can do this. They can do this profession. They can do it well. Have guidance counselors focus in schools on the legal profession, outline what it takes, and really push people that want to do that, students that want to do that in that direction, and help foster that. It has to also be done with the law school admission test. I mean, the LSAT has been the same test since the beginning of time. I think it needs to be rethought in terms of how can it be more inclusive. Law schools have to think how can they be more inclusive, and not simply look at grades and LSAT scores. What else uh, can be looked at in terms of making sure that we have people of color applying and getting into law school, and then got to rethink at the law firm level about hiring people of color, right? And oftentimes these hiring committees are the ones that don't have people of color on it. So how are you going to get more people of color if the people in charge of hiring uh, are not representing people of color? So I think the whole system has to be rethought, because we're still not where we need to be. So it's going to take a conscious effort at every part of that pipeline to get where we need to be.
Perfect. And certainly, I think it's going to help. I mean, to see people like yourself there that, uh, whether you're in high school or in college, and say, hey, look, Ryan Watkins, there's a partner. That's something that I can aspire to, right? So it's congratulations there on becoming partner there, and over the last couple of years, and all the times you've come and certainly talked with me and my students and shared about the work that you've been doing, and certainly very important, I think, the role that you play there. So we're really appreciative of you taking the time here and joining us. And perhaps maybe if you have any final words of wisdom for any students or anyone listening, to kind of wrap up everything. And once again, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, and I wish your students all the best of luck. You can do this. You can be successful. You can make it. You can make it to the highest levels of the profession, and don't let anybody tell you any differently. It certainly takes hard work, right? I wouldn't be here without hard work, but also people who have helped me along the way. So this is not an individual accomplishment. This is a team effort, uh, in terms of where I've gotten to, and it's going to be a team effort for you. But it does all start with hard work.
Perfect. So thanks again for taking the time to join us, and thanks for everyone for tuning in. And we'll see you again next time. Take care, Ryan.
Thank you.